So we've come to type 1, the last in the body center. Claudio Naranjo said that ones are anhedonic, meaning that they are unable to experience pleasure. Now, Claudio Naranjo was probably exaggerating, saying that they cannot experience pleasure, but he was actually pointing out a major challenge for this type, because in reality, they often delay gratification. They sublimate anything that can bring pleasure, or they may feel that first they have to deserve it. And there is other ones who actually say that they are just too busy for having fun, and they may also look with disdain at those who are having fun. So as a result, ones may very often behave in a way that doesn't look very sexy. But then also here in reality, they can actually be highly sexual. And most often they don't have a problem with the sexual act as itself, but they have more a problem with showing their emotions and with being truly intimate. Now, ones are often considered not to be sexual, but in reality they can actually be extremely intense. But like any other type, their ego, fixation and passion is creating quite a number of challenges in their sex lives. Now, ones are very much focused on the appropriateness of the sexual act. And this leads to certain expectations and a certain rigidity about complying with them. And if these expectations are not met, this can lead to anger and resentment. But ones can also be resentful or angry, mainly subconsciously, for not experiencing the freedom that sex is supposed to bring them. Now, as a body type, they're very much into the physicality of sex. But depending on the level of sexual repression, they may actually feel quite uncomfortable with the desire for sex or with the tingling in the genitals. And although they can be very physical, they may actually not be very sensual, let's say like type 9, for example. Now, finally, we should not forget that ones can build up quite some tension in their body because of all this repressed anger. So sex, and especially orgasms, can be a very, very good way for letting this tension go and for finding physiological release. Ones look at sex through the angle of appropriateness. But this appropriateness is going to differ from person to person, of course. And of course, ones may like to follow their desires, but they're even more preoccupied with doing things right. Now, how do they determine what is right and appropriate? Few are doing this through the angle of the physical or emotional pleasure they're getting out of sex. Few ones are going to determine what is right based on a thorough understanding of human sexuality, but they're rather going to look at it through rigid, righteous and moralistic thinking. They will look more through the lens of ethics in order to determine what is right or what is appropriate. Ones believe that there's a right and a wrong way of having sex, so they can really think in black and white terms. And as a result, they may be, let's say, overly civilized in sex, and this can be a real libido killer actually. So for example, the question about whether or not to engage in masturbation or anal sex is not going to be determined on what they like, but rather about what they feel is appropriate according to their values, and they definitely do not want to compromise on them. At the same time, they can also use this rigid thinking to justify certain sexual behavior. So for example, they may argue that caressing or oral sex is actually not sex because there is no penetration involved. So what will be appropriate or right sex for one type may be completely inappropriate for another one. So as a result, we cannot really generalize, but let me try to give you some examples which may help you in understanding these dynamics a little bit better. For example, people from a conservative or religious environment may have quite some repressive views around sex. They may perceive sex to be some kind of ritual duty, just like cleaning the house, cooking, or doing laundry. And of course, with this mindset, it's very difficult to really get some pleasure from sex. They may even go further and associate feelings of guilt and shame to sex. And this, of course, is going to dampen their instinctual and natural expressions of sexuality. And in even more extreme cases, people who are afraid of their own sexual impulses may decide to lead a celibate life. Some ones may, as a result, also feel that certain sexual positions are unacceptable, or they may marry just in order to be allowed to have sex with somebody. And very often these people may use their moral masochism, as I would call it, as a way to feeling superiority over those who are actually indulging in sex. It's very important to understand that rigid thinking does not mean that all ones are prudish, conservative, or sexually repressed. No, on the contrary, there are also ones with very liberal sexual values who actually believe that non-monogamy is the right way, or they may be crusaders in defending the rights of people with a non-traditional sexual orientation. Contrary to the more prudish ones who believe that limiting sexual encounters is a sign of virtue, the more liberal ones may actually believe that having sex very often is more a sign of having a right relationship. So of course it doesn't mean that they are in the other extreme and that everything is right, or that everything is okay, because on the contrary, some of these liberal ones may not like porn because they find that it is degrading for women. Another very important aspect of appropriateness is worthiness. Many ones, and especially the more conservative ones, believe that they have to be worthy before having sex. They need to deserve the right for having sex. Sex is some kind of reward for doing the things that they have to do in a right or correct manner. And social ones may feel that they are not worthy of God's love because of their sexual behavior. Now, this need for worthiness may also be related to oneself, and this is going to be even the strongest with the self-preservation ones. So ones may feel unworthy because it's very difficult for them to achieve an orgasm, or because they're not able to give an orgasm to their partner. Or they may feel unworthy because they feel themselves incompetent or not skilled enough in sexual techniques and positions. Or they may feel themselves unworthy of finding a sexual partner because they consider that they don't have an appealing body. There may also be feelings of unworthiness because of their own past sexual history, or they may feel unworthy because they actually have sexual desires towards other men or women who are actually not their partner. They may also feel unworthy for not being able to have a sexually fulfilling relationship with their partner. Now, this worthiness does not only relate to themselves, but also to the partner. And here this applies especially to the sexual ones. I mean, ones are not just interested in having sex for the physiological release. It's very important for them that their partner is worthy. And what this worthiness means is going to depend from person to person. So for some, a worthy partner is somebody who's intelligent. But there's others who feel that a worthy partner is somebody who would never be willing to have sex on the first date, for example. So of course, it's also very important to understand that this unworthiness is very often going to lead to resentment and anger. This complex internalized vision of appropriateness, of course, leads to expectations. Expectations about the partner, about one's own performance, about the sexual act, about orgasm, and so on. And unfortunately, most often these expectations are so highly unrealistic that they're impossible to keep up with or to meet. So it's logical that this is going to have a negative impact on sexual satisfaction of actually both partners. Because at the end of the day, meeting expectations is not fun. This is not what sex should be about. So all of this can very easily become some kind of basis for problems and marital distress. Sometimes some ones may expect themselves or their partner to be ideal or to have a perfect body. So being confronted with weight gain or pregnancy may sometimes be a turn off. The one may also expect the partner to be excited and aroused when he or she is aroused and excited himself. Or ones may actually expect that their partner has the same expectations and that the partner likes the same things like they like. Basically, that they have the same perception of what is right. Ones may also have expectations of what the partner should do or should not do in terms of sexual behavior. And they really have an image of how sex should be, and very often ones may actually have an expectation of being served by the partner. Now, it's also very interesting that ones tend to be very goal-oriented, so they're very much focused on the orgasm. And this may make them believe that they're very passionate and intense, but in reality it just means that they are goal-oriented. Because the sexual play of type 1 may very often be physically intense, but most often it's not emotionally intense. Now let's take this point of expectations a little bit further, because expectations very often lead to perfectionism and an obsession with doing things right. And this also happens in the sexual domain. The worst of all, however, is that perfectionists do not focus on what is going well, but more on the failures. They're overly concerned with making mistakes. They're overly concerned about not having sex the right way, about touching the partner in the wrong place, or about losing an erection or lubrication. So, in the mind and experience of type 1, sex is a permanent struggle between doing it right or wrong. But the point is that in sex there is no right and wrong. Sex is just all over the place. It's very intuitive. So the irony of this perfectionism is that they can be so obsessed with doing things right that they're actually not present in the moment and that they're losing sight of their partner. So whereas they may focus on being there, they're actually just in their mind. They're permanently assessing the situation. They're assessing their performance or the performance of their partner and so on. So the worst, of course, is that when they don't see or they don't want to see that all of this perfectionism is actually very unerotic and can actually be libido killing for themselves and for their partner. I already said that ones are permanently assessing the situation, which brings us to the phenomenon of the inner critic. Having sex with a one is like a threesome. There's a one, there's a partner of the one, and there's always the inner critic of the one. For ones, it's very difficult to be present in a non-judging way. And this also happens in the bedroom. They may criticize themselves, and this is especially true for the self-preservation one. They may blame themselves and say that, oh, my libido should be higher. Or they may actually want to do something new or kinky, but the inner critic is not allowing them to do so. They may blame themselves for not achieving orgasm or for not being able to provide enough pleasure to the partner. So unfortunately, they can be very hard on themselves, which really diminishes the sexual experience. However, they may not talk about this with their partner. And most often they're actually going to deny that there is a problem and just say that they really like the sexual experience. Of course, ones may also criticize their partner when the expectations are not met, and this is especially the case for the sexual one. They may blame the partner for not doing things right, for not giving them an orgasm, for going too fast or too slow, for not being active enough, or maybe for being too active, and so on. And sometimes they can be so good at blaming the partner that the partner will start feeling guilty. But the one, and especially the sexual one, is often not willing to look at their own issues with sex. And they may claim they never had any sexual problems or issues with previous partners. So, sex for type 1 is very much performance oriented, and it's not that much about feelings or connection. Now, it doesn't mean that they are not caring for the partner. On the contrary, ones can be extremely caring for their partner because they want the partner to be okay and they want the partner to feel loved for. Because at the end of the day, having a partner who is cared for is part of doing things right. But of course, sometimes this criticism of the partner's performance can be direct and very hurtful, and in other cases it's going to be indirect but equally hurtful and pleasant. And this permanent feedback, coaching and quarterbacking may actually feel as if you're having sex with your mom or your dad. It's as if they constantly want to improve you, as if they want to correct your sexual behavior and performance. And when the partner of the one doesn't listen to them, then the one can actually get quite resentful or angry. And when they feel that the partner is not living up to their expectations, then they may feel that the partner is no longer worthy. And this may actually lead to the end of the sexual relationship. Another typical feature of perfectionists is that although they criticize themselves constantly, they do not want to hear any criticism from others. And that's actually quite understandable. They are really trying to do their best so much, and even when they are criticizing somebody else, they somehow do this with the best of intentions. They really want to get it right. So they're just seeking some kind of confirmation or validation from their partner. The ultimate aim is to hear that they did things right. So they're actually expecting to get some kind of praise and not to hear some kind of criticism. The other thing is that perfectionists are actually permanently criticizing themselves. So getting a confirmation of this criticism from somebody else is just unbearable. So again, they just want to get some kind of validation from their partner to counter the permanent negative feedback from their inner critic. Ones may come across as self-confident, but in reality, they are not always. Ones actually want to get reassurance and validation, but they're never going to ask for it. And then again, very often they may even be mistrustful of positive feedback. So, what is the impact of all these expectations, rigidity and perfectionism in sexual play? Well, first of all, there is often a lack of spontaneity, maybe with a partial exception for the sexual one. But for many ones, sex is very much about tried and true. So very often there is some kind of lack of variety, or in the opposite, there may be some kind of compulsive approach to variety. But in both cases, there is a lack of spontaneity. Now, this lack of spontaneity also implies that ones tend not to initiate sex, or at least not in unforeseen moments or circumstances. There is very often no flirting or playfulness involved. And it's not because they have low desire or something like that. No, it's just that when they initiate, it's more out of some kind of routine behavior. For example, having dinner, taking a shower, going to bed, having sex. Or a one may initiate just by saying, I am going to the bedroom now, and this is some kind of invitation to the partner. But all too often, ones actually expect the partner to initiate. And once sex has been initiated, then they are really very much into it. But also, having sex with a one may feel a little bit like Groundhog Day, because every sexual encounter may just repeat the same scenario. Very often it's the same sequence of positions. It's like standardized, it's routine, and it may even feel a little bit like some kind of ritual. And ones are actually very fine with that. It's not that they're sexually unsatisfied because of that. It's just that ones don't go for what they want in the moment. It's rather what is foreseen. So it's very much like some kind of unwritten schedule or an unwritten script, and they're just following that. Of course, this does not sound very erotic and arousing, because predictability is not very arousing, right? This lack of spontaneity also means that very often there is not much experimenting. And it's not that ones don't like to experiment or they don't want to. On the contrary, they may be very interested in trying out new things or trying something kinky, but they may very often feel just uncomfortable with what the inner critic is going to say, or how the inner critic is going to judge them because of something inappropriate what they're doing. And as a result of that, they can actually shut themselves down. But if a one is actually adventurous and is trying new things, then they're mainly going to pursue their own ideas. And they may not always be appreciative of the spontaneity of their own partner. A second interesting consequence is that ones tend to be in control during sex. Ones are unable to relax because of their anxiety of doing something inappropriate. So most often sex has to be on their terms. They want things their own way, when they want it, and how they want it. And interestingly, ones can be a little bit similar to 8s or 2s in the sense that they think they know, or they're pretty confident actually, to know what the partner needs or wants, and that's what they are going to give. But they're actually not going to communicate or consult with their partner about this. And very interesting also is that ones can actually be demand resistant. So basically, if the partner wants to have sex, the one will not want to have sex. Now also here, there is a very interesting paradox, because very often type 1 is going to determine when they want to have sex, but they're actually not going to initiate it. So, when ones feel they are not in control, or when sex is not going the way they feel is right, the anxiety and resentment may get very high, and they may actually shut off themselves from their partner and from sex. Another interesting element of control relates to making noises in sex. And this is not only for ones, but actually for most people in sexually repressive environments. There may be such a level of self-control that they make sure that there are no noises or sounds being made during the sexual play. And they may actually have such a level of self-control that they're having a silent orgasm. So instead of letting the sexual energy flow, they really contain it, even during orgasm. Of course, there's other ones who will compulsively make sounds because that is how sex should be. Of course, it is still not natural, but again, it's a very controlled thing. I've been talking about type 1 wanting to be in control, and it may give you the impression that they're dominant and always active in the bedroom. And indeed, they may be pretty intense and very active, but it doesn't mean they always like to be on top. Interestingly, many ones actually want to be the bottom. They feel that in daily life they are in charge so much already that now they somehow deserve to be served by the partner in the bedroom. But they do this in a very interesting way. They're like, I want you to be in charge, but in the way that I want it. They basically would like to be submissive, but in a dominant way. So, in order not to lose control. Another important characteristic related to these expectations and inner critic is the overthinking. Very often, ones are not present with their desires. They're not in touch with the sensations in their body. At the same time, they're also not emotionally connected with their partner. They're not really intimate. Instead, they're very much overthinking and overanalyzing everything. Very much in a similar way like you can expect from type 6. Now, this whole rational thinking often makes them lose the human experience because sex is actually very emotional in nature. And of course, this mental anxiety can have quite some negative consequences. I mean, just imagine if you are permanently thinking, can I keep my erection? Am I going to get an orgasm? Are we doing this at the right pace? Am I giving enough attention to my partner? You're not in your body. So instead of making it a nice sexual experience, you're actually killing it. The mind is just too busy and prevents the person from truly relaxing and enjoying sex. Clearly, being a perfectionist at work may have some merits and your boss may actually really like it. But being a perfectionist in relationships or in sex, there's hardly anything positive to say about it. So let's maybe go a little bit deeper in all the negative consequences that this perfectionism can bring. But before we do so, I want to make it clear that it's not only ones that can suffer from negative consequences related to their passion or sin. It relates to all types. However, for type 1, some of these consequences may be more direct and more visible. For other types, they may be less visible, less direct, but they can be equally destructive for sexual satisfaction. So it's not that ones are necessarily sexually less satisfied than other types. All types can be equally dissatisfied, but just for different reasons. Now, it's important to understand that criticism and perfectionism can really create difficulties in truly enjoying the sexual experience. And it often creates challenges in fully embracing sexual desire, excitement, arousal, and even orgasm. And all of this can lead to reduced sex. And when people have less sex, there's going to be less of a sense of connection with a partner. And this is going to further reduce the pleasure that one can get from sex. Or type 1 may actually also prefer to avoid having sex rather than facing the possibility of doing a bad job. So perfectionism is not only the ultimate self-sabotaging device in sex, it's also contributing to the alienation of the partner. So it's very important to understand that expectations and perfectionism are real libido killers, and they actually lead to performance anxiety. Now, in average cases, it may just lead to some sexual anxiety and some reduced or lower sexual satisfaction or some problems with sexual self-esteem. But in more unhealthy cases, the consequences are going to be even worse. It may lead to feeling guilty after sex. There may be sexually related depression, erectile problems, or intercourse pain, or even problems with arousal. And this does not only apply to the one, but very often it may also be passed on to the partner of the one. So listening to everything I said about type 1, you may get the impression that the sexual act of type 1 is quite cold or lukewarm at best, mechanical, contained, anxious, stiff and boring. Or you may get the impression that ones are unable to get any pleasure out of sex. Well, this is only partially true, because what I have been telling so far is actually only half of the story. Quite some ones, and especially sexual ones, or those ones that have quite liberal sexual values, may not really find themselves in what I have been telling so far. Now remember that type 1 has a connection with this arrow to type 7. When ones feel that they have done everything they had to do, then they feel they deserve to have some fun. If they have worked hard during the week, then they think they are entitled to have some fun during the weekend. When they feel that they had to do what they had to do and they are finally on holidays, then suddenly all the inhibitions may be gone. So suddenly, ones may become very passionate, intense, explorative, open-minded, fun, spontaneous and adventurous. When ones are relaxed, there can actually be a high degree of sexual expression. So when a one doesn't feel that sex is a ritual duty and not something that they just have to do, but some kind of reward for living appropriately, then they can almost go into the other extreme. Suddenly, ones may allow themselves to indulge in sex and get completely wild, but only once they have done what they needed to do first. So ones may actually go into the other extreme and there may be no inhibitions, and they may end up in situations where they're actually covered in urine or semen. And again, what I'm telling now is an extreme case, but all what I want to do is for you to be able to understand the behavior in case this really occurs. So, in order to fully understand the sexual behavior of type 1, you also need to carefully listen to everything I'm going to say about type 7. Just like with all the other types, there's quite some divergence or differences among the subtypes, and I mentioned already quite a few of them. Now, the self-preservation one, and especially if they are also sexual blind, is potentially the most inhibited and the least spontaneous of all 27 subtypes, because they're extremely good at repressing their instinctual needs and urges. They can also be the toughest on themselves because they constantly want to perfect themselves. And most often they're actually not going to admit when something is actually going wrong. They hardly express their needs, and it may feel to them as if they're somehow egoistic if they're asking for something. It's as if they're thinking like, I'll be fine even if I don't get my thing. But at the end of the day, they're still going to be resentful about it, but they just will not talk about it. The sexual one is actually the counter type and shows up very differently in sex. The sexual one is very intense and, contrary to the other subtypes, may actually be quite emotional. Quite some sexual ones actually say they feel quite some intensity around the mouth and the neck, so they may like talking and kissing. They can also be quite uninhibited, and they can actually put their nails in the back of the partner. Sexual ones basically want to break all boundaries with the partner, and nothing should be a taboo for them. They want to touch their partner everywhere, and they also want to be touched everywhere. Now the focus of the sexual one is very much on the partner. They expect the partner to know what they want. They expect the partner to be turned on when they are turned on. And they are constantly monitoring and judging the performance of their partner. And if things are not going their way, or the way that the one thinks that things should be, then they will very easily actually criticize their partner, and this can really kill the self-esteem of their partner. They hardly ever see the fault in themselves, but always in the partner. Now finally, social ones. Their behavior is going to be more dominated by their secondary instinct. So if the second instinct is self-preservation, they're going to be more similar to the self-preservation one. If the second instinct is sexual, they're going to be more emotional and more intense. The peculiarities of the social instinct are more related to the sexual values, more about their attitude towards these sexual values. Social ones want to be some kind of a role model for others. They can be a little bit like crusaders, and they may really try to convince others of their own views. They may have more of this superior feeling about their way of having sex, and they may actually get resentful or even angry when other people don't agree with them.